Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of American Rambler. I'm your host, Colin Woodward. Thank you for listening to the podcast. On today's show, I have historian John C. Rodrigue. His latest book is Freedom's Crescent, The Civil War and the Destruction of Slavery in the Lower Mississippi Valley. It's available through Cambridge University Press. It is a very substantial book. It is well-researched, well-argued, very detailed, and I am learning a lot about the whole process of slavery being destroyed, as the title would suggest, but also the process whereby the Union went from the Emancipation Proclamation to the abolition of slavery in the 13th Amendment. It is a topic that has been written about, but I've never read this much detail about that process, which is incredibly complicated. And has a lot to do with state power versus federal power. And John weaves together the military commanders who are making emancipation happen on the ground, but also what Lincoln is doing, what Andrew Johnson is doing in Tennessee. So he's looking at various states and the political factions involved. So he's got a lot of material here that would really swamp a lesser historian, but John has really great control over the material and holds it all together. I know he's been writing about Reconstruction for a long time now. This is his third book, but it is an impressive piece of scholarship. He's written about Louisiana Reconstruction after the war in the sugar plantation regions of Louisiana. And he's written a book on Abraham Lincoln and Reconstruction. So John's been doing this a long time, really his entire adult life. So that he can write this book, I just got to tip my hat to him. And you will get a lot out of it, and you will learn a lot, regardless of your level of understanding of this time period. It's very complicated, but John does a great job of laying it all out. So we talk about his book, and we also talk about the history profession generally. I wanted to pick his brain about, should an undergraduate consider going to get a PhD, considering how many tenure-track jobs there are right now, which is not a lot. But it's part of a long-term trend that's very complicated, and I'm not going to dumb it down too much about what's going on. I mean, I don't know everything that's going on with the profession, obviously, but it seems to have gotten a lot worse since the Great Recession, with austerity, cutting of funding, and COVID, and Trump, and the attacks on democracy have only made it worse. More attacks on intellectualism in this country and public education. And again, it's a complicated topic, but things are not looking great. And I wanted to hear what John had to say about that. I'm tipping my hand here in terms of our take on it, but it's been 4 years since we talked, and a lot has changed in the profession in that time. It's amazing it's been 4 years since we last talked, so I wanted to not just talk about his book, as impressive and important as that is. I wanted to talk about the book, but I also wanted to talk about history generally, as I like to do on this show. It's great to talk with John. I know him from my days at LSU. He was a professor of history, and I was a graduate student, and I took some classes with him. And he teaches in Massachusetts now. He's been at Stonehill for about 15 years. I've tried to keep in touch. Couldn't believe it's been 4 years. So it's good to have him back, and that he has another book, and he's got another book planned that he wants to start at some point on the planters. He's thinking about retiring now, so he has a few more years of teaching, and then his book on the planters might be what he does in retirement. And if it's anything like this book, it's going to be a very detailed and serious piece of scholarship. So it was great talking with John again, and I hope you will enjoy my talk with John C. Rodrigue. But yeah, thanks for doing this again. I looked up our previous podcast. I couldn't believe it was 4 years ago.
Oh,
so
okay.
It's been a little bit of time.
Right. The antebellum period, I guess, for our equivalent, right? Before everything.
Before the apocalypse, yeah.
Right.
Okay, well, congrats on the book.
No, thank you.
I made a pretty good dent in it. I know you were being modest and said, I didn't have to read it all, but I don't know. about 100 pages in. I agreed to read it for the Arkansas Historical Quarterly. So
Oh, you have? Okay.
whenever you'll have a positive review to look forward to.
Well, as I've said to a couple of people, I'm not sure what I'm more afraid of: people not reading it, or people actually reading it.
I know.
Um,
I feel the same way.
yes,
And
right, yeah,
the worst thing you can do is like Google it and see, some random review on like a guy's blog or like some weird
right.
website for books. And it's like 3 stars. What the hell? But yeah, it's, maybe we can talk about this later, just like the profession generally, but it's, a lot of publishers are getting weird about giving away review copies.
Oh,
Um,
sure.
I haven't had that problem, but some people have. So a place like Arkansas, I can basically just volunteer for the book review. And if I already have the book, they're like, okay, cool, go ahead.
Oh,
But
right.
I know with like the Southern and some other places, like they're just not reviewing stuff like they used to, or not, I don't
Yeah.
know. But anyway, so how long have you been working on this book, John?
Well, let's see. I guess really formally 11 years. I think I started it sometime around, I think it was in 2012. And if I recall correctly, it was right around the summer and fall of 2012.
Okay.
Um, and it was when my previous, book, the Lincoln and Reconstruction book, was done and in production, and this book, in many respects, was an outgrowth of that one. So I can almost, sort of had the beginning, the thinking about it, though, as you can imagine, there's, backstory there. But I guess it was in 2012, I think that. So not quite 11 years.
Okay. But
Um,
in a way, I mean, this is kind of like your life's work, right? I mean, you've been doing Reconstruction forever. Sometimes it's hard to say like when you actually start a book.
right.
But 10 years, I mean, yeah, that's truly understandable. I mean, this is a substantial book.
Yeah,
And
and actually, I mean, no,
yeah,
you're right. I mean, and I did say in the intro that I, in a sense, been working on this for my entire, career, 30 years. Not really, but kind of in a way. And
yeah,
it is true. I mean, I didn't, this was not a kind of, traditional come up with an idea, do the research, and then do the writing. When I came up with the idea, I could just almost start. I just started writing it, really.
yeah,
I mean, I knew stuff I was drawing on, and because it's stuff that I had read previously, it's research that I had done. So it wasn't like I said, okay, I've got this idea, let's go to the archive, spend a few years in the archive. So I feel like I was a bit of a fraud here, but it's not like I spent years in the archives and then sat down and had a mountain of material to start writing. It was just stuff that I had been working on and thinking about, again, for years, and so it really grew out of that. Um,
yeah.
mhm.
Well, it's funny how that imposter syndrome never really leaves you, does it?
No, nope. The
I mean,
fraud police.
I'm not on Twitter anymore, but when I was on there, I mean, there'd be like early academics or grad students, and they're saying, "Oh, I just feel like such an imposter," and it's like that never stops. I mean,
No, right, right.
and I remember a long time ago. I mean, I think you were still at LSU, and you were talking to me about, because I think I'm sorry, it's not called Raising Cain, but you initially were going to call it Raising Cain, but
It was, yes, right.
Reconstruction in the cane fields, and it probably had come out, and you said you were thinking about what to do for your next book, and you're
Mhm.
kind of deliberating, should it be short and sweet and I get full professor, or kind of go the like magnum opus Genovese, like mind of the master class kind of thing.
Right.
So it kind of looks like you did do something short and sweet with Lincoln, and now this is sort of your Genovese book, for lack of a better word.
That,
um
yeah, well, that's kind of true. Except there's a whole other story there that that is going on, which I don't know if you probably don't really want to get into, too much. The way you frame it, it sounds and I don't mean this as a criticism, but it almost sounds like I had it all figured out, which of course was the exact opposite.
Well, you knew you wanted to write another book to get full professor, but you're like, do I
Okay, I
want
had
this to
that. I
take?
had that much of a plan I had.
should this take 5 years or 10 years or 15? I don't
Right.
know, but
Yeah. Well, look, actually, you know what? Look, let me tell you, let me give you the very brief abbreviated version. I did kick around with a couple of what I thought were going to be, distinct projects, small distinct projects, a couple of them. One of which was something on the 1872 election in Louisiana, which was a very dramatic event. But then I finally decided not to do that. And I was going to go on this, what I thought would be the magnum opus, on this huge book on the planter class after the war. This kind of
okay,
Genovesian thing, but after the
yeah,
war. And I'd been working on that, for a long time at LSU, and then even when I made the switch to Stonehill. But then I had the opportunity to write that Lincoln and Reconstruction book, and and that I thought was a kind of a nice opportunity to just do a small, distinct, book, 150 pages, and to kind of take a little bit of a break from the Planters book, because that really had become something of a quagmire. And
yeah,
so, I said, okay, let me do this, and I can get a book out of it. And then what happened was the Lincoln and Reconstruction book led to this one, which I guess you can say is the magnum opus.
yeah.
But it was really kind of accidental,
Okay,
and
but
so
yeah, go ahead.
no, and so we can, later on maybe we can talk about the planner book and where that stands. But go
Okay,
ahead with your question.
yeah, because there's a lot of historiographical threads running through the first couple chapters. Because yeah, I
Yeah.
wasn't sure what to expect. I was thinking maybe it would be more of a like, I mean, there's nothing wrong with this, but like ton of primary sources, ton of archival research. I mean, which you did do, but it's not that kind of dissertation kind of feel to it. You know what I'm saying? Like you're
Yes.
talking about a lot of the secondary literature with, published primary sources and everything, but there's a lot running through. I mean, you're kind of talking about, well, I mean, as you say, it grew out of your research on Lincoln. So you're kind of talking about, who actually freed the slaves, agency versus oppression. And like, so there's a lot of threads running through this, but just really quickly, I don't know if we talked about him last time. Was Genovese there at Emory when you were there?
Yeah, he was actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did we talk
In
about
fact,
him?
I'm sorry.
Did we talk about him at all? Like,
I don't know.
did
I don't
you know
remember.
him at all?
Yeah, well, actually, as it happens, I mean, there's, this is, we could talk about this the whole time. When I first got to Emory, was when coincidentally, they had just hired Elizabeth Fox Genovese.
Yeah.
And so we arrived there, and I mean, I kind of generally knew her, but I have to admit, I wasn't really that familiar with her, her work. I mean, I knew that she had done stuff on French history, and so it was that's how I kind of, I mean, I was already interested in Eugene Genovese's work, but that's how I kind of got in their orbit. So they were, Gene was around, and so I guess you could say I kind of worked informally with him. But
Okay.
and I did, Rourke was my advisor, but I did work closely with Betsy, and she was on my dissertation committee. I kind of was involved a little bit in their orbit, but Gene was around, when
Okay.
I was at Emory, but I never took any classes, with him. He did eventually have this kind of joint appointment with Georgia and Georgia Tech and Georgia State, but that was after I was already doing my dissertation.
Okay. So yeah. So did you ever have like a stop and chat in the hallway or anything? Like, did you talk to him at all, or was
Well,
he
he
just
wasn't really around Emory
okay?
that much, but
Okay.
I did, but in working with Betsy, I had been her TA one semester, and did help a little bit, like as a research assistant and stuff. So I was like, I was kind of around the house a lot with them, as as a lot of graduate students were, not as much as the people who were genuinely their students. So no, I mean, I did, I mean, I kind of hung out with them and with Gene and other people quite a bit, actually. So
Okay.
yeah,
Were your interactions with Betsy positive? Was she good to you?
yes, as we know, that's a loaded, that is a whole, yes, my,
Okay.
yeah,
But
I
that's totally in keeping with probably most departments, or you know what I mean? Like there's always those kind of people in departments. I'm not excusing anything. I've heard kind of stories about both of them, but you could just as easily have had, well, she was always nice to me, you could have kind of one of those relationships. I don't I
right,
don't know. But I talked to
yeah, well,
Stephanie Curry about the Genoveses and
Yeah,
moving
right.
on
I
with
know
the
that's
day.
a whole, yeah. And that, as we know, that's just the whole whole story there. Um,
Yeah, we don't need to go down that route, but
I don't
I'm
think
glad
so.
you.
Well,
Yeah,
probably best, yeah.
I'm glad
But
your
I,
interactions with
no,
them
but no,
were good.
look, I mean, but I have, I've always had, the greatest, admiration and respect for their work and Gene's
Sure.
work. I mean, I don't consider myself a knee jerk disciple and, of Gene's, work interpretation, but I'm, and as anybody can see, I'm deeply influenced by it. I think there is a certain validity to what he was saying there. We can maybe get into this later. I think a lot of this newer literature, which I do talk about, just seems to completely like not even engaging with it, just completely ignoring it.
Yeah.
And this this whole notion that like the brutality and the horrificness of slavery is somehow a new discovery. Just you
Right,
know,
right. Yeah,
I,
no, I've seen the pendulum kind of swing back to more slavery is capitalism, unfettered and the
right,
oppressiveness. But then, yeah, you have all these generations of slave community and resistance and things like that. So I guess this pendulum's kind of swung back in the oppression end of things. But no, I mean, and as you make clear in the book, there's a ton of historiography on all these issues, and you're kind of balance. You're trying to balance these.
that would be a good way of saying it. Yes, a fair way of saying it. Yeah.
Is it wrong to call this a synthesis?
Well, that is actually a good question, Colin, because when I first started working on this, I was calling it in actually kind of a defensive way. I really was, referring it to as a kind of synthesis of pulling stuff
Okay.
together and yet trying to come up with an original argument. But then people were saying to me, you're kind of selling yourself a little bit short by calling it that because there is a lot of primary source research in here. Maybe not a lot of archival per se, though there is some, but a lot of it is, and then I realized this myself. I mean, a lot of it is just because you don't have to go to the archives anymore for a lot of this stuff. The Lincoln papers, are
Right.
just readily available.
Yeah.
And so, admittedly, there is some more archival research that I could have done for this book. I know where the weak spots are. I know discerning reviewers will find the weak spots, and I'm, prepared for that. But I was prevailed upon, by several people, a number of people, to say, look, you're selling yourself short by just calling this a kind of synthesis, because I mean, all works are a synthesis to one degree or another. It's not like, as you say, that graduate work, your dissertation or your first book, which is just deeply, infused with archival research. But to call it a synthesis would probably be a little bit selling it short, though, as I say, I mean, I readily recognize that I'm building upon previous work. I mean, was it really necessary for me, for instance, to go yet again through the Banks papers, the Nathaniel Banks papers? I mean, maybe yes. Might have been
Yeah.
stronger. It might have been better if I had done stuff like that. But, that stuff has been really worked over. There's a lot of people have used that stuff. I just made a strategic decision that I wasn't going to go that route,
Yeah.
But again, there are certain things that I know that maybe there's some soft spots that would have benefited from some deeper archival research. But you know what? I don't think I would have found anything that contradicts the argument that I'm trying to make. That's, I know, a pretty arrogant statement, I suppose. Maybe I would have, but if anything, I think the archival research only would have further confirmed what I was trying to say here.
Yeah.
So
Well, and I think you still managed to have some quotations from Lincoln and stuff that I haven't really heard before or not as familiar with, because I mean, as you know, like sometimes certain primary sources have been worked over so much, it's almost like a cliche. Like
yeah,
especially the Civil War era, it's like they quote Howell Cobb on emancipating the slaves every time. It's like so that can be kind of annoying if you're in this field. But well, maybe
yeah,
just kind of
that's a good point. I don't. I'm sorry. I know you have a
yeah.
question, but that's a good point. I did have to be careful about using those old hackneyed quotes, which I was often, and then in a number of instances, I was tempted to do, and I said, no, leave it out.
Yeah,
Everybody
yeah.
knows that one.
Or maybe
Yeah,
just you go down a couple sentences and you get a chunk from the quote that's a little different at least, but
right.
saying the same thing essentially.
But you were going to
Well,
say,
well, let me just start with the basics here. You're talking about the destruction of slavery in the lower Mississippi Valley. What exactly is the lower Mississippi Valley?
Good question. I kind of, I note that a little bit in the introduction. I mean, for my purposes, it's basically parts of this Tennessee. It's Tennessee, the four states that seceded and joined the Confederacy. So I'm not really dealing systematically with, Kentucky and Missouri, but it's essentially really like basically from what the geographers would say, from the confluence where the Ohio, meets the Mississippi, and then south there. So those four states, Louisiana, Arkansas, Tennessee, Mississippi, but then really focusing on the Delta areas of those states. So, for Arkansas, more eastern and southern Arkansas rather than the upcountry per se. I don't really deal that much, for instance, with eastern Tennessee, and Tennessee is such a weird geographical state. I do deal with eastern Tennessee when it's necessary, when I'm talking about state level stuff. For the most part, I'm focusing on western and central Tennessee. As I note, Americans in the 19th century, Americans did have a general awareness of what they called the Mississippi Valley or the lower Mississippi Valley. It is admittedly kind of amorphous, and I do have one quote from who it is, Meneg, who says that all geographical areas are to a certain degree abstractions. Let me go way off topic. I mean, one book that thinking about this was Tim Snyder, the guy who does the work on Nazis. His work, Bloodlands. I don't know if you've read that.
No.
The book on basically, Eastern Europe in the 1930s and 1940s, the area between Hitler and Stalin. He's looking at the area. I know this is a weird comparison, admittedly, but he's looking at this area between the Baltic and the Black Sea, and the millions of people that were killed, either, by Hitler and by Stalin in the 30s and then in the Second World War. And looking at that as a distinct geographical area.
Yeah.
So it's admittedly, it's a little bit of a contrivance, but it's not made up out of whole cloth. People had an awareness, and certainly during the Civil War, the Mississippi, who could deny that, right?
Yeah, and you lay it out pretty clearly in terms of slave ownership, plantations, percentage of planters in a certain region or whatever, and obviously Arkansas not as much as parts of Mississippi, parts of Louisiana. So you see, you lay that all out, and the reason why you're doing this, because I think another historian put it this way: it's like this is the center of gravity for slavery, right?
Oh, I wish I knew that one. Who said that? I wish I'd known that one.
Bonner. I think that's a quote from Bonner's book.
Really? How did I miss that?
Slavery. That's okay. I used it in my book, so I remembered that phrase.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
But we'll talk about why you focused on this region.
Yeah. Well, that does kind of go back to the Lincoln and Reconstruction book. When working on that book, I guess I was always just kind of in a way implicitly aware of this, but it never really sunk in. But then, as I was spending so much time in the Lincoln and Reconstruction book, looking at Louisiana, Arkansas and Tennessee, I'm like, geez, I never really thought of it quite like that. Okay, there's stuff going on in Virginia and West Virginia, and that's interesting. And, you can make the argument that the West Virginia situation is really important because, for the first time, you're admitting a quote unquote new state with a demand that there be no slavery. And so that's, that really is important. But is it really a coincidence, right, that the area was so important militarily? And that you can argue that that's really where the war was won. And that in this state is where there's the most extensive wartime reconstruction. 3 of the 4 states abolished slavery during the war. That's not a coincidence. And so that's kind of where the idea, came to me. My work on Louisiana history in particular. So I was familiar with that, and so I did have to bone up a little bit more on Arkansas and Tennessee, but that's kind of where the idea. And then it dawned on me, it's like nobody's done this before,
right?
Like of all the stuff that has been written,
I know,
the vast literature, and nobody, there's Armstead, there's of course, as I note in the footnote, there's Armstead Robinson's classic dissertation. But there's no single book that does what I'm doing here, and so it's like, wow, this was, I guess I was destined to do this. I don't know. And again, it sounds kind of hubristic, but it just, once the idea came to me, I know this is going to sound really weird, Colin, but once the idea came to me, it really did. I mean, I saw the whole thing unfold in front of me. Now, I envisioned a 250-page book with 10 chapters, right?
Yeah.
But because I could see like I could use certain books as set pieces or articles, or things that I was familiar with from the Freedom Project and other stuff that I had done. I could say, oh yeah, I could do a little episode here. You got the Black military experience here. You got Port Hudson. I could pull together all of these different stories and put them into this whole. So I know it sounds kind of weird, but I really did see the whole thing in front of me when the idea, at least in terms of its broadest aspect, the New Orleans and Memphis massacres would just make a beautiful way to close it up in the epilogue. That's kind of how it happened.
Yeah, well, you're right. I mean, there's surprisingly not a lot of literature on this. And you mentioned Robinson's dissertation that eventually got turned into a book, but I think it was published after he died.
Oh yeah,
right?
many years afterwards, and that in itself is a long, fascinating story.
And it's quite a bit different from the dissertation. I mean,
indeed, yeah.
So, and it seems like the West, in a way, you could go to, I guess you could talk about the East more, or you could talk about the West more, but it seems like the West is kind of more of this laboratory for emancipation and these ideas about emancipation. In the East, not so much, because they're just not making as much military progress, right?
That would be a good way of putting it. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So maybe let's kind of talk, because some of these things that you talk about, I mean, you talk about them in detail and very, very clearly, but like they're still kind of confusing to me.
Oh dear.
And in terms of kind of what a piece of legislation does legally versus what it kind of does in practice, and you talk about the confiscation acts, and without getting too deep in the weeds here, maybe just talk about a little bit about those two things, because those really kind of set the stage for the Emancipation Proclamation, which is another category altogether. But like, maybe just talk about those two things, because those seem to be pretty key in terms of getting this process moving. Maybe just talk about those two acts and what they do.
Oy vey. Now you're really putting me on the spot, right? I mean, yeah. But no, I think, look, let me try to look at this from a broader perspective. I'm not trying to dodge the issue by any means. I really don't. Have you read the section on that yet?
I forget exactly where I am.
It's pretty deep in the weeds, right?
Right.
But I'm really like, this is like on the ground, and does this area come on, particularly the second one, the 62 one, does this ground that we're standing on, is this included or excluded from the proclamation? Right.
Right.
And did the slaveholder, did they take the oath of allegiance or did they not? And so people were like really aware, like, this doesn't apply to me. And it's very easy for us to see in hindsight, oh, that doesn't matter, blah, 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 blah. But no, at the time, people were like, no, I'm good on this. I've taken the oath of allegiance.
Yeah.
You cannot take my slaves away from me. It's my property. And so it really did matter, to people at the time. I don't know if this is really answering your question, but how this policy stuff really does play out on the ground really did matter. The whole slave agency thing and self-emancipation, you can say, oh, that policy really doesn't ultimately matter, but it did.
Yeah. And I think it seems like with the first Confiscation Act anyway, like the laws passed, but the Army is just kind of doing their own thing anyway. Like, they don't seem to distinguish between loyal and disloyal slave owners, really.
No,
they're just not going to return the slaves.
Right.
They're just not going to return them if they get to their lines. But the second one does allow the slaves to fight, right? So they join after that.
Right, yeah. And that in the Militia Act too, which more clearly does that, right? But it's laying the groundwork for certainly for Black military experience.
But in a way, it's good for Lincoln, because these things are happening out west where there's not as much scrutiny. So maybe if there's some screw ups or things aren't very well coordinated, maybe they're not going to hear about it so much in the East. Is that kind of part of it? It's like they have the liberty to do this.
That, perhaps that might be the case. It probably is more just a function of what's going on in the field versus
Yeah.
the policies that are being shaped. It really, I as I try to show, I mean, it really is in this area in the lower Mississippi Valley where this stuff is really, getting confusing and really has, meaningful applicability. That's not to say that this isn't going on in Virginia and the Eastern Theater. It really is a mess. And it's really a mess because of federal military success. They're gaining
Yeah.
ground, capturing territory, and they're making progress. Whereas that's not the case in Virginia. And as I point out, we're so familiar with, dealing with this question of, the slaves running away to the Union Army. But what happens when the Union Army comes to them? And so now what is the role of the military going to be? Is it going to maintain the slave regime or to undermine it?
Yeah.
And if it's to undermine it, then how are you going to win over the loyalty of the slaveholders if you're undermining slavery?
Yeah.
It's just,
not to muddy the waters even further, but when emancipation is finally issued, again, there's this sort of confusion in terms of who does it cover, because you have sometimes people will say the Emancipation Proclamation didn't free anybody. Then other people say, well, it did free some, but not others. But again, is this a difference between like the legal reach of it versus the practical reach? Was there a lot of areas that weren't covered by emancipation that are essentially going to be liberated anyway, and it doesn't matter when the proclamation's initially issued? If that makes sense. Like, so when Lincoln issues it January 1st, 1863, you have the border states that aren't covered by it, but like occupied areas, let's say wherever, Virginia, Mississippi, whatever, like the slaves in those occupied areas, are they freed at that point, or is it still kind of this nebulous world they live in where they're under occupation? You know what I'm saying?
yeah, well, yes and no, and again,
Okay.
I get into a lot of the specifics, as have other people, like James Oakes and others. So I'm not, certainly, I mean, everybody who's done emancipation has had to deal with this. I mean, but when you really get down to it, right, the main thing was, Lincoln said that the main thing was representation in Congress. That was it. Like, that was the main criteria as to whether an area, at least in theory, was going to be included or excluded. Of course, Lincoln winds up not following that, and I talk about that. He excludes Tennessee, all of Tennessee, even though they're not. And then he excludes, southern Louisiana, only part of which, not all of which, but only part of which had actually held congressional elections. So Lincoln doesn't even follow his own criteria that he spells out in the preliminary. But that was the criteria. So it wasn't even really so much whether an area was occupied by federal troops. It was whether there had been any substantive attempts toward organizing loyal governments and returning to the Union. Okay. And so there were areas, and I talk about this, I mean, there were actually areas like in northeastern Louisiana where you probably did have a few instances in which there were enslaved people who, for one reason or another, had not yet been freed by the Confiscation Acts, and yet now would be freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. So there probably were some instances of that happening. In its totality, as we know, for the most part, the proclamation only applied to areas that were still in rebellion and effectively under Confederate control. So in that regard, it didn't, in actuality, free a whole lot of people. And we know that. We're familiar with that story. And again, there are areas, and I talk about this in southern Louisiana. There are areas, these planters in St. James Parish, they say, look, we're excluded from the proclamation, we're excluded from the Confiscation Acts. We're loyal,
Yeah, but it didn't necessarily matter. Yeah.
Well, it did matter to them, though, and that was
well, it matters to them, but maybe not to the army or whatever.
Well, yeah, but that's where we get into what I think the other thing that I'm trying to do, and is show the difficulty of getting from military emancipation to actually abolishing slavery as an institution, and as a political problem. And I think, as I try to say that, that's one of the big things that I think the literature has in a way kind of overlooked. And there is a tendency to And I know here I'm being, again, this sounds kind of hubristic, but I am kind of being a little bit, critical of the previous literature in kind of maybe making the assumption a little bit too quickly that once the proclamation is issued and assuming military victory, then slavery is done for. And I just think that there's a lot of evidence to demonstrate on for both pro-slavery and anti-slavery side that people were aware that it's not. The military emancipation is not going to be enough. And I don't mean to be selling short, Michael Vorenberg's book or any. I mean, I love his book and I've used it. If anything, I see my book as a complement to his book on the 13th Amendment. I'm not saying that his book is wrong or anything like that. I draw freely from it, and I use a lot of his insights. I guess maybe I just go into a little bit more detail on the antecedents to the proclamation. I'm sorry, to the 13th Amendment that he does. I see myself as very much complimenting what he was doing.
Well, and you talk early on about there was this understanding before the war that abolition, if it was going to happen, had to happen at the state level. So
totally,
kind of trying to, the abolitionists are working against slavery, but if you are trying to accomplish this state by state in the South, I mean, it's just not going to happen. But people didn't feel like the federal government had that power. There's nothing in the Constitution saying this, right? That the states have to abolish slavery. There's this kind of an understanding generally.
Yeah, you're right, that the federal consensus,
Right.
it's not even, as James Oakes, I mean, it's not even in the Constitution, and yet not everybody, but almost everybody subscribes to it. This idea, and in an odd way, it is kind of an unintended consequence of what, Will Entz convincingly, I think, talks about in No Property in Man. The slave states did not get what they wanted at the convention, was that express sanction of property in man in the Constitution. They failed to get that. But the flip side to that is they wind up getting, in this argument that slavery is strictly a state or local matter, they basically win protection from federal interference, under what will come to be known as the federal consensus. The federal government can't do anything. And Vorenberg, this is a key insight that I take from Vorenberg. Very few Americans before the Civil War would have thought of amending the Constitution, not just to abolish slavery, but for any kind of substantive change. You could tinker with certain things, but they considered it almost to be kind of sacred. We know, there was the original quote unquote 13th Amendment, which during the secession crisis, which would have guaranteed basically federal non-interference with slavery in the states. But even that was not really a major change. That was only stating what everybody believed in anyway. So it's not like people were like that the amending the Constitution was unthinkable, but amending it to make any fundamental changes in it, which then as Eric Foner notes, the Reconstruction amendments basically do rework the Constitution, reinvent it. I've got a little bit off my point there.
Sure.
This idea of amending the Constitution was not part of the abolitionist program.
Right.
And I think there's that assumption that, the proclamation doesn't abolish slavery, so we'll just pass the 13th Amendment and that'll give constitutional sanction to a military measure. But that's not the way people would have envisioned it at the time.
And so what happens by 1865 then when they finally they have the 13th Amendment and they're going to implement it before they're doing this before the war is even over.
Right.
What changes by then?
That's jumping. Yeah, I mean, really, the meat of my book. The meat of my book is what happens in 1863 and 1864. Once Lincoln wins re-election, then that's it. It's game over, right? We know for the Confederacy, and then that's where they put on the full court press to get the amendment. But as I note, it's not until then. It's not until late 64 and really early 1865 that the focus is now on the amendment as the be-all and end-all. And that's only because of the way things ultimately unfold. And then I think, because there's no Reconstruction legislation, so there's no blueprint for Reconstruction by the end of the war. Lincoln is assassinated, the whole martyrdom thing, Reconstruction becomes a disaster under Johnson. And then I think there's almost this, things get reinterpreted. This, as I say, this retrofitted idea that the amendment had always been the be all and end all, the main goal, the main, way that that slavery would be eliminated, and that's just not how people saw it at the time. If I could elaborate a little bit more on that, Colin.
Sure. Yeah.
I've always felt that this book was admittedly something of a mashup. In that, as I say, because there's two overarching themes. The first one is to show the multidimensional process of emancipation and abolition in the lower Mississippi Valley, and where limited emancipation, universal military, state abolition. I lay that out. And so in that regard, I could have just done that with the book, and I think it would have been, certainly worthwhile. But as we know, we're always, the way this profession works, we always have to think about the larger meaning, the larger importance, And so I was thinking, maybe there is something to the effect that problem of getting from military emancipation to constitutional abolition. You could make an argument, okay, yeah, the lower Mississippi Valley and wartime Reconstruction does play a role in that, but it's not as important as I'm claiming, and that, there are other factors. And that's true. There are other factors. And I think you probably could do a book just on that, the second part of it, the getting from military emancipation to constitutional abolition, which is not focusing specifically on the lower Mississippi Valley, but is looking at, what's going on elsewhere. And so I've always felt that it was kind of something of a mashup of two books, a narrative history of the ending of slavery in the lower Mississippi Valley, and then a broader study on how we're going from military emancipation to constitutional abolition. But I think, and so some reviewers and some, readers might say, well, the link there is a little bit weak. And I will grant that, there are other things going on. And yet I think I do, in the totality, I think I do, have enough evidence to show that at the very least, there is an important aspect, that there is at least some kind of causal connection there between wartime Reconstruction in the lower Mississippi Valley. Because, as I know, because of these conservative unionists, these guys who are trying to organize loyal pro-slavery governments. And Lincoln and Republicans they're very much aware of that. They're not dismissing these people. This is a real threat. And so I think, I do have enough evidence, and I think I can establish that at least there is, to some degree, a causal connection between wartime Reconstruction in the lower Mississippi Valley and then this larger shift, how we get from freeing slaves to abolishing slavery as an institution. And it'll be at the state level, but then the 13th Amendment will complement state level action. It's not an independent measure, the 13th Amendment.
Yeah. And by, as you say, by November of 1964, when Lincoln's reelected, there's no going back really to the way things were. And also this kind of, I don't know how important this was, but like betraying the African Americans who had served, who had supported the Union in whatever ways, like you also have to sort of consider these 200,000 guys who've joined and fought for their freedom. To go back to slavery in kind of any form, it's almost impossible, right?
Yes, right. You would think that.
Would.
Yeah. No, and Lincoln always said that he was never going to go back on the promise of the Emancipation Proclamation. And one of the reasons he says that is because of the Black contribution to the war. And, it is very, very difficult to envision for us some scenario in which slavery could have survived Northern military victory. But that's only because of the way things ultimately shaked out. To people at the time, it was not as inevitable as it might look in hindsight. And again, okay, 200,000 men served in the Union military, tens of thousands more served as military laborers. But as we know, by the end of the war, maybe 500,000, maybe some more, right, the 3.5 million of slaves in the rebel states, right? The large overwhelming majority of slaves in the Confederacy were still enslaved at the end of the war. Even in lower Mississippi Valley, that was true.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and we can't just simply assume, that everything would have worked out the way it ultimately, did. Yes, once Lincoln is reelected, then it's game over. Really,
Yeah.
But up until that point, it was not. And I think it's necessary to at least envision possible scenarios, alternate scenarios, how this ultimately could have shaken out.
And if Lincoln had lived, obviously, I think his Reconstruction terms would have been a lot harsher on the South than Johnson's were. But maybe just talk a little bit about like what direction was Lincoln going toward the end of the war and thinking about Reconstruction.
Yeah, I mean, I actually, I don't do that so much in this book because I did it in the
Yeah.
previous one. I did, my epilogue, I called it "What If" because that's the key question, right? And that is the thing. And I had talked about that. I think what I had said in the previous book was that we're so obsessed with what Lincoln would have done on the question of race and racial equality, and I don't think that's the problem. I think the problem is Lincoln's economic thought, because he really did come out of this small property holder producerist mentality, of the Republican Party and antebellum America. How that would have worked in trying to transform the plantation South would have been the real problem, rather than racial equality. I have no problem with envisioning Lincoln embracing universal male suffrage and equality before the law. I think, but here's the thing I think is really interesting, and I talk about this a little bit in the epilogue in talking about what if Lincoln had not vetoed the Wade Davis bill, or what if Lincoln, and here's another way of thinking it, and not if Lincoln had lived, even taking into account Lincoln's assassination, but what if Lincoln and Republicans had been able to agree on some kind of Reconstruction legislation that would have set out a plan before the war, and that would have limited what Andrew Johnson could do, right?
Okay.
Because there's no plan in place, because Lincoln assumed that he was going to be in charge of Reconstruction, because obviously he could hardly have foreseen that he would be assassinated. But what if there had been some kind of which again was something that was really important to people at the time, having a legal blueprint in place that will require the seceded states to come back with free state constitutions. But what if there had been something in place that would have essentially handcuffed Andrew Johnson after the war, right? How different would things have been then? Now, Lincoln didn't want to be handcuffed, right?
Right.
But I think, it would have been good if Johnson had been.
Because of
So
all the pardons, right?
I mean, the whole thing.
Yeah.
The whole thing. When we think of what if Lincoln had not been killed, sure, but even if Lincoln had, nonetheless Lincoln had been assassinated, but there had been at least some blueprint in place that Johnson would have to follow.
And I don't know if we talked about this last time, or maybe it was many years ago, but like sometimes people talking about Reconstruction, they say, well, the way to go was property confiscation and redistribution, the kind of the 40 acres and a mule idea. Do you think that would have worked, or would that have been a good idea? I mean, because it does seem like that would have helped, but maybe it would have just created even a bigger backlash against Reconstruction. I don't know. What do you kind of what's your take on that?
Well, there's been a few people who have suggested, Eric Foner, but others, that, basically the creation of a black peasantry would not have been the panacea that it is sometimes assumed to be. We can point to all sorts of places in the world where people have access to land and they're still impoverished.
Yeah.
So the creation of a black peasantry would not necessarily have. It certainly would have been better in all sorts of ways, and it would have provided, in some respect, a firmer foundation. And it was never going to work. Here I am talking about alternative scenarios, right?
Yeah,
um,
yeah,
it's unlikely that it would have been able. And again, Lincoln, if Lincoln had not been killed, Lincoln never would have gone for something like that. Can't imagine a world in which Lincoln would have supported property confiscation at that level. But
right.
I think the thinking of that is that somehow that would have been the panacea, and I think that's not correct. It would you can envision a scenario in which Reconstruction and Black economic advancement certainly could have benefited from something like that, even if there, as there had been this backlash. I can't imagine. Well, I guess we have to imagine an even worse backlash than the Ku Klux Klan and what ultimately did happen, right?
Right.
I guess it could have been worse, but I think the people who have at least suggested that would not have been a panacea, I think there is something to that argument.
Well, and what's kind of your take? I mean, Johnson obviously is kind of a disaster. What do you think might have been done that could have made Reconstruction more effective? Or do you not like to think that way? You just kind of want to see what did happen and analyze it. Like, do you think there was maybe a path that wasn't taken that could have improved civil rights in the South? Or, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I know. Talk about inevitable, right? You look at how could it, given the whole totality of, racial thought in the antebellum South, the circumstances of the war, how things were handled. It is difficult to envision a Reconstruction that could have somehow been a quote unquote success, whatever that means.
Yeah.
And yet, as historians, we can't, and what I'm trying to do in this book is, we can't allow ourselves to fall into the inevitability trap, predetermination trap. We do have to envision, or at least think of how things might have been different.
Well,
they could have been better, as Foner notes too in his Reconstruction book. They could have been a lot worse.
Right.
Imagine a Reconstruction without the amendments.
Well, and that's the thing. If you look at radical Reconstruction, it's probably the most progressive time period in our history. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, no, totally.
150 years ago. It's pretty scary when you think about that. But maybe to segue into, I do want to talk kind of the profession more broadly, but do you teach Reconstruction right now, or like every year, or you've taught it at Stonehill, I'm assuming? Like,
I do Civil War and Reconstruction, pretty regularly, every other year or so. When I was at LSU, and this has to do with the legacy of T. Harry Williams, right? Which, is part of how this book ultimately happened. But back when I was at LSU, that they used to do the Civil War, as you know, and Reconstruction, separate classes. And so Charlie Royster had taught the Civil War, when I was there, and I taught Reconstruction, which I loved, because then I could do as much of the war as I wanted to, and not have to worry about the military stuff and all of that, which I do actually, I love, but I wouldn't have had to, spend a lot of time, having to, to teach the, going into the real, deep details of the military stuff. I still do, I teach that now, but it's Civil War and Reconstruction, the more way it's traditionally done.
Now, kind of, how do your students respond to Reconstruction?
Because I'll give you three guesses.
Boring. No, but like, seriously, like I think is like in the profession generally, I'm assuming you saw Skip Gates's show on Reconstruction. The documentary came out maybe like 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah, I did. Yeah. I don't remember a lot from it. But
well, that's the problem. Is like I feel like it's just a different animal from the Civil War per se. That I don't know. Maybe it's just it doesn't have the battles the way the Civil War does. Like, but there are people like Carrie Lee Merritt and others. They kind of want to have for this to be this popular enthusiasm of Reconstruction, and it just never seems to kind of land that way. Like, what do you think the issues are there in terms of connecting the public to this period, which is very important, no doubt about that. What's going on here?
Well, I don't have the solution to that one.
Okay.
It's not, there's nothing, war and battles and stuff is sexy, you know. I mean,
Right.
on the one hand, though, I guess in response to your, the first part of your question, though, I guess, and the way the students respond. I mean, I have to say, I mean, at Stonehill, the students are pretty good at appreciating the importance of this. On the one hand, admittedly, in the evolution of this class, the way I teach it, I do find myself paying more attention to the Civil War than I used to, and less attention to Reconstruction.
Yeah.
But also, in a good way. I think that's something, maybe that's a good thing, Colin, because then that really forces me to say, okay, what's really essential here? I mean, we can go into all of the specifics and all the gruesome details about Reconstruction, but what do they really need to take away from it?
Right.
And so, in an odd way, spending maybe less time on it helps me to convey to them what they really need to know about this. And so, I have to cut corners. I can't go into all of the details, but maybe I've actually kind of found that is actually maybe helpful in conveying the importance of it, is not getting bogged down in all those gruesome details, but saying, look, these are the 4 or 5 things that you really need to take away from this.
Well, and somehow Reconstruction, it feels more complicated to me than a lot of periods. I mean, maybe that's a weird thing to say, but like there's so much legislation, and as you try to balance in the book here, there's state level things, there's federal level things. It's changing state to state based on military advances and everything. But once you get after the war, I mean, you're still dealing with all those issues. So you got, Reconstruction in South Carolina versus Louisiana versus Virginia. So I mean, it's just an incredibly complicated period, and I've never felt like I've adequately kind of digested it and trying to explain it to someone
Right.
in a soundbite is virtually impossible. I mean,
right. Yeah. And the thing is, it's so important now for what's going on with our, so-called, yet another racial reckoning.
right.
The importance of this stuff is, you can't overstate the importance. But as we know too, try not to get too discouraged with, Americans. And I know that I'm making a broad generalization here, but can't we say Americans? But Americans, sure, they don't know anything about Reconstruction, but a lot of Americans don't know anything about anything in American history. So
Right.
they don't know the American Revolution. They don't know, they don't know, the Second World War. And so, it's not just the complexity of Reconstruction where the historical ignorance comes from. So, that's just part of a larger problem. And certainly, as we know, and has often been, discussed, what role the professional historians have to play in that. Certainly, there's a lot of American history that Americans don't understand in addition to Reconstruction.
Yeah, and I just don't know. I mean, whether it's Henry Louis Gates or Ken Burns, if you can really put it on a platter for people where they can enjoy a certain time period and understand it and everything. Some periods work better than others, and you're going uphill. I mean, any historian who's not dealing with either the Revolution, Civil War, or World War II, I don't know. I mean, maybe some people, Vietnam,
Right.
there's still sort of a memory of that, but we're dealing with a very deep-seated kind of historical amnesia, historical illiteracy, whatever you want to call it. And on that positive note, but you've been talking about retirement. What do you see as your future? How many more years are you going to be teaching?
Oh, that's
you're not sure.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in my 60s now, and so let me just say, I love teaching. I mean, despite all of the problems of academia, and Lord knows today, but I still love teaching. And I try to keep my eye on the big picture. I mean, I actually get paid to do this. I mean, are you kidding me?
I know.
And so, that, but on the other hand, I mean, I have no aspirations to be teaching until I'm 75 or 80 years old. And how much we want to get into this now, but I certainly do increasingly feel like a dinosaur in this profession. I mean, isn't that the thing though? As historians, we know things change change
Sure.
change is inevitable, and how, you have to just roll with the punches and can't just say, oh, I'm not doing it or whatever, because we see there's all sorts of examples in history of people doing that, and it usually doesn't work out well,
Do you,
so
do
change.
yeah, I mean, do you feel like things have changed more? And I mean, certainly the last 3 years with COVID and everything, the attacks on the Capitol, like it's been a weird time, but like you think even before that, like have there been things happening that you see as obviously things change, but maybe are bigger challenges than were there before, if that makes sense?
Yeah, well, it is. I mean, certainly, yeah. I mean, there were all sorts of, things were definitely starting to look a little bleaker well before, the last 3 or 4 years, for the academy, for the humanities, history. So it's, it is hard not to be discouraged. And then some of the things that have happened now with COVID and everything else have only, accelerated that.
Does it just kind of come down to jobs? Like the jobs just aren't there the way they used to?
Well, yeah, but as we know, that's only symptomatic in a way. That's symptomatic of
Right.
the larger changes that are going on in academia. If as Lincoln had said, about slavery, even if they gave me all the power, I wouldn't know what to do, to get rid of this, and how to solve some of these issues.
Well, I think it's like a lot of things is kind of a perfect storm, of weird, economic changes, technological changes, demographic changes. But when I talked to, I guess this was after we talked, because it was so long ago, but I did talk to Eric Foner, maybe 2019 or 2020. And
well, anything that Eric Foner has to say is worth listening to on anything.
well,
So,
right. And I mean, he's not a spring chicken, so he's got a lot of experience and a good point of view. But he said he would advise against people going into PhD programs at this point.
Oh, totally. Oh, I agree with
Yeah.
that. I hate to sound.
Sure.
I mean, look, that's what my advisors told me in the early '80s. They didn't say don't do it, but they said,
Right.
you be aware of what you're getting yourself into. They said no. They said to me, look, if you want to do this, go for it. But they said to
Yeah.
me, if I were in your shoes today, I wouldn't do it. And so, but today, no, I would never. I would never, as much as we're supposed to mentor students, I would never say to a student who was thinking about going to law school, I would never have done this. Say, oh, you should go to graduate school. I would never. I mean, I'll help students and answer all the questions, but I never thought it was in my position to try to persuade a student to do one thing or another thing with his or her future. That
Right.
being said, when I had talented students, I would have, I might have said, at least think about it,
Yeah.
at least consider it. But I wouldn't even do that today. And I do have a couple of really talented students who would 10, 15, 20 years ago, I would have said, you might want to think about a career in academia because you really have what it takes. And I wouldn't do that today. I wouldn't even suggest it.
Yeah.
Go to law school and, sell your soul and at least, make sure you get a good price. I hate to sound so cynical, but I would
Yeah.
not.
Yeah.
I would not even suggest.
Well, you at
And
least
it's
have
bad.
you have a good paying job. If you finish law school, you pass your bar exam, you're going to get employment somewhere. But
Right. Even though,
academia,
as we know, that's not Shangri-La, even in that regard. But yes, you have a
sure.
pretty
Yeah.
good,
I mean, you're
as opposed
marketable.
to, this, 10,
Yeah.
12 years of your life. And then, maybe if you're lucky.
In the job situation, it's so bad. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm not looking for a teaching job, but like I still check the board. You go to HNet or you go to whatever other site, like Civil War era, there's maybe a couple jobs a year
Right.
at an Ivy. It's like, oh
Right.
great,
Yeah. Yeah.
so that's bad. But I think, yeah, I mean, there's all these other things, and student debt is such a big issue right
Right.
now.
Right. I
If
mean, these things are not,
anything,
they're not unique to people going, for graduate degrees in the humanities and the liberal arts. I mean, the kids coming out of college, with pre-professional stuff, BAs, and, up to their, eyeballs in debt, and they don't,
right.
their job prospects, are not exactly great.
When did you start at Stonehill? What year?
'07, the fall of
07.
'07.
See, that
Yeah.
was like a great market, like
Oh, the good
mid
old days.
2000s. Because I had those same talks too with people when I was an undergrad. I was thinking about graduate school. I had this one professor. She said, I have been through this, and she wasn't full time. She was an adjunct, but she's like, there are PhDs who are driving cabs at the airport. So like, remember that. And I was like, okay, yeah, whatever. And then 2004, 2005, like, yeah, it was like the golden days. It's like there are jobs everywhere. And then the recession hits, and that kind of put a stop to that. And we're just
Yeah.
seeing more and more attrition. So in a way, like, I got a job, you got a job, like that. Maybe there's just like a very small window where things were good. But like you said, yeah, early 80s. I hear horror stories still about the 70s and everything.
Oh, right. Sure.
But also, you weren't going into six-figure debt to get through school then. So,
Right.
yeah.
Only
Okay.
five.
Well,
The low five. I did a year and a half at Columbia, and that was enough. That messed me up for like
yeah,
years.
I'm still paying student loans,
Yeah.
and I
Yeah.
wasn't really that bad in. I mean, you just
Right.
you don't think about, you don't break it down mathematically late, like when it's happening, but when the bill comes, it's pretty shocking. So,
Yeah.
okay, well, to end on a more positive note, do you have an idea for another book, or you
That's
taking?
the positive? Well, there was this planner's book
Okay,
that I had put on the back burner, and that's the funny thing is, I did the Lincoln book to take a break from the planter's book, and that was supposed to be the quote unquote magnum opus, but again, the Lincoln book turned into this one. But I still, here's a situation where I really did spend a lot of time in the archives, and I've got a ton of material. I got way back when I got an NEH, summer grant, so I've taken the people's money,
sure.
and so I have to do something with this in the years that I have left, the time I have left, which, we don't know from one day to the next.
Right, right.
But, assuming I do have a few more years left of, productivity, to do something that will take a while, but yes, it's doable. I'll have to take a break, obviously, from this for a little bit, but,
Sure.
I would really feel like that would be left as unfinished business. If I
Is
did
this
do something.
also a kind of geographically sweeping, or were you focused on like one state
No,
with
the
the
whole
planner?
South,
Okay,
the whole
okay.
South. This was intended to be, I hate to say a magnum opus, but this really was
Yeah,
intended to be like the second big book.
okay.
When, what we were saying later about when I was deciding what to do next, this project has a long history, and I really should, when after I've been able to kind of, just take a little bit of a break and decompress a little bit, I really do need to get back to that. So like maybe this summer might be a good time to start thinking about how to get back into that stuff and
Yeah.
come up with some kind of workable strategy and game plan.
Well, I, I don't have any regrets about my research when I was at LSU, but one thing I kind of wish I could go back to do is look through some of those plantation family records and like maybe sort of reconstruct some of the plantations in St. Francisville, or you know what I mean? Like kind of maybe more of a narrative, like
Mm.
daily life thing. Cause
Mm.
I feel like there's just a lot of stuff probably everywhere. Every state has it. Just kind of recreating that world a bit. I'm assuming you've read All the King's Men, that novel. Have you ever read
Oh
that?
yeah, totally. Yeah, a long
There's that
time ago.
part.
Yeah,
Okay, there's a part about the LSU grad student who's writing this dissertation about this planter family, and he never finishes it.
that long digression, right? Of the
Right.
whole. Yeah,
Kind
yeah.
of like go back and sort of do that in a way might be kind of interesting. But
Right.
most important thing obviously is finish it. But do you have a chunk written, or is it kind of more
Oh
just
no, no,
research?
there's nothing
Okay.
written. No, it's just piles of stuff.
Yeah.
That there really is a lot of archival, and I did actually draw on some of that for this book. Again, I wasn't completely faking it with this book, but that other one, there's a lot of, I still have a lot of stuff that I even still really have to go back through.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's, if there is a next project, that really should be it.
Well, I kind of feel like if I'm disciplined, I probably have enough research I've gathered over the years to like just last me the rest of my life. Because I've got a lot of boxes of things, but it's like one big project and another big project. So if I do any of that, it's going to take a while. But I feel like I don't need to do the type of research I used to do. I mean, which is
Right.
just, daily craziness in the library. So,
Well, actually, why don't you, if you could, I mean, why don't you tell me a little about the Johnny Cash book, if
sure.
you can?
Yeah. Well, I was in Arkansas for a couple of years and wanted to write about somebody from Arkansas. And Cash obviously is really, really well known, but I was getting into his story about what he's doing in Arkansas because he's born there, grew up there, played concerts, over the years and stuff. So it kind of snowballed. It kind of started as finding some cool things in the archives, photographs and concert footage. And
Mm-hmm.
then I started it was a very fragmented in terms of like my approach. I would kind of write a later chapter and then an earlier chapter and then said, well, I've got too much for articles. Maybe I'll just do the whole book, but then I had to kind of stretch out certain parts. So it's maybe a little all over the place. It's kind of biography, it's social history, it's music criticism, all that stuff. But
Right.
it was a fun book to do because it's so different from the first one. But
Sure.
I'm glad it's done. It's not setting the world on fire, but some people have been reading it and been getting some good feedback. And I'm also pleased it's only like $25. So it's like,
Yeah.
the first book
I,
was
I,
40.
I know, well, I have to admit, I haven't read it yet, but I haven't bought it yet, but I do intend to. I really do want to read it.
Good, good.
It,
Well, you're a music guy. I mean, have you ever thought about writing like about a music figure or music, I don't
the
know,
thought has crossed
band or
my
something?
mind.
Yeah.
Not seriously, not seriously.
Yeah.
But yeah, it has, the thought has crossed my mind as well. Why not mix these two things of, professional credentials and doing something that you really genuinely have a love for. Um,
Yeah. I mean, changed your life. I mean, Johnny Cash, he's kind of more of like a later guy I got into. But, if you're talking like the classic rock bands or something like that stuff just floored me when I first
mm,
heard it. But I feel like more academics are kind of writing those books.
right, sure.
Um,
No, they're actually kind of fun.
Yeah,
you
no,
know,
I know. It's getting a nice reprieve from other stuff, but again, kind of where I'm at now, just like I'll read whatever. I mean,
right.
I'm not teaching, so I don't have to keep up with the class syllabus and stuff.
I've always made it a point myself to read stuff outside of my field, which probably means that I don't get to read as much stuff in my field that I should read. But, I've always, even going back to graduate school, just made it a point. I don't really read a lot of, contemporary literature per se. I probably should read more than that. But, I love reading, biography and history in areas completely outside of my field.
Oh
Um,
yeah, yeah,
and even
absolutely.
other stuff too, not even just history stuff. But I've always tried to do that just to maintain my sanity.
Yeah, I think it's good to read fiction too. I mean,
Yeah, I
it's
should admittedly.
uh, I'm trying to think of the last thing I've read. I don't know. Yeah, I've got a lot of stuff. It's kind of I'll read a chapter here, a chapter there. So it's like have 10 books going at once. Not to sound pretentious, but it's just like, I'll be into this for 100 pages and it's time to move on. So it's kind of like I guess I'm still in college. I'm just kind of
Right.
like reading for
Yeah.
5 classes.
But
But
again, like I said earlier, this book by Tim Snyder, the Bloodlands that I read, actually really helped my thinking on this book.
yeah,
And so just reading other stuff is just, I think, really it is intellectually, profitable. And it
yeah.
really can help you think, just get it, doing something entirely different, but then even think, it helps thinking in the stuff that you're doing.
Have you ever read that book Blitzed about drug use in the Third Reich?
No.
I've kind of got that on my wish list at Amazon, but it I think it's a popular history, but it was
Oh,
pretty well received. But yeah, you might want to check that out if you want something a
okay.
little out of the ordinary. Because
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to reading. Because I did read something about Nazi Germany not long ago by I don't know if you heard of Charles Sidner Jr., who I guess his dad was Charles Sidner Sr.
Hmm.
But he taught in Virginia, and he wrote this book
Oh,
about
right.
the SS division. So I read that, and then I came across this book Blitz. So I was like,
Oh,
oh, I got to read this because I think Hitler was, I don't know, he was on morphine or I don't know, he was a wreck. as we well know, but physical wreck in addition to being a mental wreck. So yeah, you want some happy reading. You can read about drug use and Third Reich. Well, John, congratulations on the book, and thanks again for talking with me. Glad we could do this.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Colin. I appreciate the opportunity. Enough about me. Let's talk about my work, as the saying goes.
Okay, that was my talk with John C. Rodrigue. I hope you enjoyed that. Once again, the book is Freedom's Crescent, The Civil War and the Destruction of Slavery in the Lower Mississippi Valley. It is available through Cambridge University Press. You can get it in paperback, as I have. And I'm about page 340, so I got a ways to go, but I've made a really good dent in it. It is a book that you have to pay attention to. And I've been learning a lot, and just, again, I'm really impressed with how much work went into this and the research and how he's able to hold it all together. So congratulations, John. I hope you're doing okay. We've been having some March Madness here in Richmond, and by that, of course, I mean the weather, not the basketball tournament. The weather's been up and down, and we've had some cold, blustery weather recently. But it was spring like today. It was in the 60s. It was sunny, really nice day. The kids went to the playground after school and ran around there for a while. So nice day to be outside, riding a bike, taking a walk, doing whatever. I'm looking forward to the start of baseball season in a couple of weeks. Already got my tickets to see the Red Sox and Orioles in Baltimore in April. Red Sox have been playing well in spring training, and I know spring training doesn't really mean anything, but hey, wins are wins. And hopefully they're going to have a much better year this year than last year. Definitely looking forward to watching games on Sunday, because it's not a whole lot on TV on Sunday. I'm missing baseball, so it would be great when it can start up again. And if you're interested in a baseball talk, you can check out my episode from a couple months ago where I talked about Gaylord Perry with David Vaught. That was a good talk. So spring is almost officially here, and baseball will be here too. All right, I hope wherever you are, the weather's been getting better and you're doing okay. I'll be talking with you soon. Take care. Bye.